Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations. I'm Robert Rowland Smith and I'm with Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hello, Robert. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. We are going to try and look at the subject of peace and conflict. We're calling this episode From Conflict to Peace.
Yes.
I'll make a few remarks and then I'm sure you'll come in and improve them. That title, From Conflict to Peace, suggests straight away a movement. We're not just talking about conflict and peace or peace and conflict as though they're static phenomena. And I suppose that already suggests something about systemic work, which is that we are in the business of making a movement or a transition from A to B. And maybe From Conflict to Peace describes nearly all constellations at some level, because there could be an inner conflict that leads to peace as well as an outer conflict with another individual. But whatever it is, a constellation, I think, exists to create a movement or to catalyze a movement from something conflictual, internally or external, to something peaceful, where the conflict is resolved. So in that sense, we position peace as a resolution to a state of conflict or struggle or opposition of some kind. But I want to get in early a point that peace in constellations, in my view, is still a means to an end, not an end in itself. So peace is the condition, the best condition in which other things can happen: love, thriving, creativity, good action, and so on. But perhaps we can come back to it, but I wanted to just lodge that for now.
Yes, wonderful. It's a wonderful description, Robert. And, we were talking in the beginning, I was sort of leaning more into the peace than the conflict. So obviously my learning is on the conflict. I was thinking about it in constellation terms, how, as you say, it's oppositional. So the two are highly related, and at an individual level, we have a choice at any moment, relationally, to move into conflict or to move into something that is more inclusive, that often leads to feelings of peacefulness. And that isn't to say that peacefulness doesn't serve struggle, growth, development, striving. But there is something about how energies or dynamics that might be revealed in a constellation show that a lot of the energetic force might be tied up in a oppositional dynamic. And that often, that all the sort of classics are involved, hurt, betrayal, rejection, abandonment. And I was just, in a way, moving sideways, if you don't mind me for a moment, thinking about how our body is subject at times to, a range of different, assaults, either viruses, traumas, accidents, etc. And yet the body of its nature is always primed for healing. And in a way, I would like to take that dynamic and use it relationally as well, to say that even though we may tumble and fall and divide and blame and separate and be hurt, that perhaps the movement that we're, the sort of wave that we're tapping into in constellations is that there is a desire for some coming into balance.
I love that, that idea of the body having a default, actually, in some way, which is to repair itself. So an accident doesn't lead to an immediate collapse. The body will always try to repair itself. And it makes me want to say that I think the system, and certainly the field, seem to be biased towards that too. The system wants that to happen, is oriented towards healing, but often gets impeded in that by human choices, to use your word, to enter conflict. I did want to put a rider on something you said there about opposition and conflict, which is that, as you'll know far better than I do, actually, from your psychotherapeutic work, there is good and bad conflict. There is safe and unsafe conflict. And I think it's worth making that distinction early on in this conversation, because safe conflict and safe opposition allows for growth, allows for learning, allows for empathy, understanding, changing of opinion, the opposite of intransigence, compromise, and so on. So actually conflict can be good in presenting us with what is other and what is different, and that from which we can learn and that to which we might have to adapt. So let's sort of kind of, I guess, lodge that.
That's great. And I would just now think, let's label that loving conflict.
Right.
The way that you might have a heated and spicy discussion in some kind of relationship about something, but the assumption is that the baseline is a love and a respect, an affection, so that all voices are heard. And it may be that this is something that appears, they say, is it episodic or is it perpetual? And perhaps it's perpetual. This is a flashpoint that will always come up and will need to be looked at and discussed from different angles. So I would call that loving conflict. And I guess the point we're maybe stating is that in the other kind of conflict, love has been occluded somehow.
Yeah.
It's not included in what is happening.
Yeah. And we should probably use the word relational a couple of times, Nicola, that in our conversation today, we are talking about conflict and peace from a relational point of view, even though we are recording this against the background of issues of global conflict and attempts at peace. I think maybe in another conversation, we'll talk about constellations and politics kind of more broadly and how to include systemic approaches in that. But just in terms of the scope of today, I think we're talking more relationally, aren't we?
We are. And I think that, people sort of listening or watching might immediately go, when they see the title, go to those kind of global forces because they're so present for all of us. And we're all struggling with how intractable they may seem at this point in time.
Yeah.
But hopefulness of some resolution.
Yeah, exactly. So shall we maybe narrow in a bit on each of these terms, peace and conflict? I'll defer to you, since you've identified as the peacekeeper in this conversation, and clearly I'm the belligerent warmonger, the conflict stoker. I some time ago did a lot of work on Freud's work on peace in relation to the death drive. And his argument, controversial and bizarre, is that human beings definitely are wired for peace. And we were saying a moment ago, you were saying certainly, that there seems to be, like the body, a drive in the system for healing and for the overcoming of conflict and the wounding that can go on to the body and the psyche. Freud goes one, or in fact several steps further, and he said, yes, actually, this is a very profound instinct in the species as a whole to return to a state of peacefulness. And his very odd argument is that that's because we as a species began as single cell organisms, which were very, very simple. And the story of evolution for Freud is a story of increasing complexity that hasn't served us. And in fact, the desire for peace, it is a desire to return to those origins of the inert, of the non-troubled, the unperturbed, because that's the only form in which peace is sort of properly available to us. And he even goes so far as to revise his entire theory of psychoanalysis to say that, yes, we are creatures who seek pleasure, and wish fulfillment is the guiding engine of all our actions. But pleasure, too, is merely a means to an end, and the end of pleasure is peace. Pleasure for us, the true pleasure, comes not in excitement, whether it's sexual excitement or joy or other kinds of excitement, but the release or the relief that ensues once that pleasure is being sated.
It's interesting, and and far be it from me to, to take a different viewpoint to Freud, but and that single cell is it's a fusion of the energies of the putative mother and father, and that single cell is held within the relational dynamic of the mother. So I would say yes and.
Yeah.
Yes, and because there's a lot of work on that prenatal experience and how
Mm.
impactful and informative it is. So I'll hold both because I find that interesting.
Mm.
But of course, as they often say in therapeutic work, if it's not the other, it's your mother. So everything tends to come back to that, initial crucible of life.
I can't help slipping in the one joke I know here from psychoanalysis. What's the definition of a Freudian slip?
I don't know. What is the definition, Robert?
It's when you confuse one thing with a mother. Seemed appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. It was. Thank
It
you.
was not too bad. So I'm curious to know how you think about peace in constellations, whether you think peace is the same thing as the resolution. We talk about getting to a resolution, don't we, in constellations, and we recorded a video on that actually.
Mm.
But I'm wondering if peace is the thing we're aiming at always. Is peace the same as the resolution? And do you
Yeah.
to sort of connect those two or not?
So I'd probably distinguish, and I'm thinking, even as I'm talking about peace, I'm asking myself, am I actually talking about presence? Am I talking about, for the issue holder or seeker, a capacity, maybe, in the sense of if there is an arc in a constellation and it's just a piece of time among many pieces of time, that at the end of that constellation, perhaps the peacefulness that I might be describing is a sense that the issue holder or seeker can presence everything that belongs, that is kind of emerged in that constellation, to be seen, perhaps to be understood a little better. So peace may not mean that every element, every ancestor, every living individual represented in the constellation is having their best moment. But overall, there is a marquee of peace. There is some sort of overriding sky, which is lovingly tolerant of everyone and everything that they personally are working through and may not have resolved or may have to offer. So there's something about this peacefulness. Peacefulness is flowing, around and through. And there is a sense that, there are steps to be taken. There are things, bits of life to be integrated and come to terms with. So, once again, I'm in a yes and mood this morning. It's something, there is a sort of a peacefulness, but there is still that sense of the vitality of life and a next step.
Wow, Nicola, how beautifully phrased and really expertly articulated. That's fantastic to hear that description. It made me think of a more straightforward definition of peace as well, that I would add alongside what you've just said, perhaps, that in systemic terms, that peace is the, how should we put it? There's a song by Radiohead called Everything in Its Right Place, which is a kind of one of the more famous songs. And in a way, that's what peace is in the constellation. Not just that everyone has a place, but everyone's in the right place. Everyone belongs in the right place. And a lot of conflict, as we know in constellations, arises from people being in the wrong place, actually. And we have a kind of guide to where the right and wrong place is through the thing known as the orders. So there are very simple ways of, there are kind of a rubric almost for where people should be. So if you, for example, are a first wife, you come before the second wife. in time. And conflict, internal, external, or both, can arise when the second wife assumes the systemic place of being the first, and vice versa. For example, similar with siblings and so on. So there is quite a convenient way of thinking about peace in constellations to do with place and belonging. And maybe that's also a reminder that constellations, for all its strangeness, is at some level quite a straightforward practice of geographical distribution.
Yes, yes. And, you've sparked something I hadn't been able to articulate before, but this idea that, the systemic conscience is focused on completeness, which, brings its own kind of peace. But one of the issues that are revealed in constellations is that completeness is across generations. So it's almost like a vertical completeness. And the fact that it's vertical creates some difficulty, so that, a grandmother who died in childbirth, and that grief that's not being integrated by the family because all the constraints around it were just far too difficult, that resonance may appear 2 generations later, with our issue holder who's, appearing and talking about creating their own family. So that may get revealed in a constellation. So there is a completeness of something, a completeness of experience with a systemic constellation, but it causes disruptions across the different generations. And our work, in a sense, is kind of tilting that vertical line back into a horizontal line in its own generational bandwidth. So that may be slightly a complicated description for people who are listening, but it's just to say that there's a difference between completeness and peacefulness, because completeness is in spite of anything almost, and peacefulness recognizes the evolutionary movements and tasks of the individual soul within the system.
Wow. I mean, that's so rich what you just said there. I think it contains as well something worth identifying that's pretty, thinking about it, controversial and debatable, I suppose, about constellations, which in a sense is that we can fix the past. We can go back in time in constellations and revise, more than rewrite, but readjust those previous generations on the vertical axis in order for peace to be able to eventuate later on down the line across the horizontal in some way.
Well, I think that's great, because I think when you articulate it so clearly, Robert, I think that's our illusion. So we don't fix the past. We if I use the word fix, but we know I'm not actually saying fix, but we fix the present. We don't fix the past. But because the past has happened and the past is the past, we're doing movements, we're offering sentences which allow the present to just be the present.
Well, I mean, now we're really getting into something, philosophically speaking, I think, because I think in constellations we are dealing with 2 versions of the past. There is what happened, the facts, and those are empirical and beyond dispute. They happened or they didn't happen. And then we have the versions of those facts, or the truths that individuals may or may not hold. We can't change the facts. We can change the truths. We can change the way in which those facts are held by people from previous generations and people in the present generation. So, for example, if you set up a dead ancestor in a constellation, we can't change the fact that that person died or died a particularly difficult death. But we can, for example, invite them to take back what belongs to them, the trauma that belongs to them, and not pass it on down those generations, so that they can support peace further along the generational line by keeping the conflict where it belongs in time and just with the facts.
And it's interesting because I noted you use the word truths.
Yeah.
Would you accept the term beliefs?
Well, the reason I use the word truth, I was influenced by a podcast I had recently, which made this distinction between fact and truth. And I think because the word truth, we made a recording about this, the word truth has become so hijacked by truths, plural, that truths and truth has become belief and almost interchangeable with belief. You know, my truth is this. It's become highly subjectivized, doesn't it? So yeah, I'm happy to exchange it for belief as a term.
Okay, because it just allows us a little more freedom, I think, in the personal experience is a definite and important category. But we do know that, as we have spoken before, but it's always good to underline something, that families we know to be very protective of their image and their community, and so that narration is often highly edited about what has happened in the past, and generally cast in the favor of the family.
Yeah.
With all the complexities that brings for those that come after.
Yeah. Yes, that's interesting. And that creates a culture, a sense of belonging, an identity, a kind of meaningful truth for those involved. And maybe the word meaning is just as relevant as the word truth in that sense. You know, it is meaningful, and that meaning shouldn't be messed with too much.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in a way that speaks to the bravery of people who come and do constellation work, because they often are in distress and they want something to flow better in their life, and they open themselves up to what needs to be healed, within them in relation to the past, so that they can move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. There was something else which kind of went ding as you were talking earlier, and it was actually back on the notion of conflict in particular, and about the usefulness of conflict, which maybe is a kind of provocative way of describing it. But what came to mind is that play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Edward Albee, which, for those who don't know it, is a famous story of a highly conflictual marriage, most famously acted by Richard Taylor and Elizabeth Burton, whose off-screen relationship seemed to be more or less a mirror image of what was happening on screen or on stage. And it's about a couple who argue endlessly about this and that, and their comfort zone appears to be conflict. And of course, one of the conclusions you reach, or are tempted to reach watching that, is that conflict is their love language. You know, the conflict may seem war, but it's kind of an expression of love, and it's the way in which they meet one another. This is a match of two equals, and the more they vilify one another, castigate one another, I think even physically attack each other at some point, the more they're saying, we're on a level, we're equals, we're matched, we're in this together.
Yes.
And so there's an interesting inversion there of what conflict means. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind, because conflict can have its uses. We talked about hatred before as a bonding process. Go on.
That's exactly, you're raising a wonderful point. So with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, they were also married at one point. Once, I think, if not twice, but anyway. So they were a high volatile couple. And as you say, people contact each other and bond in different ways. So I think we can understand this globally as well, that actually conflict bonds. That may not necessarily resolve, but it does attach. And I think that's so, there is an attachment that's created. And whether that is the end point or not is an interesting question. But for some couples, as you say, and this can even be, a parent and adult child, the basis of the relationship may be on at least not ignoring each other.
Mm. Yes, and that's brilliant, because what goes on in that drama is exactly that. They are never ignoring one another. Everything, in fact, is noted, hyper noted. There's a mutual level of vigilance, which is kind of excruciating, really. But I think the other term in that, for conflict to work, it's, to use a much used term these days, it has to be consensual. It's consensual conflict. And perhaps there is even a relation there with conflict extending to other forms. I'm thinking of kind of sexual forms of aggression towards one another, which are consented to, because I think it's probably on a continuum with what we see with the Virginia Woolf, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf play. Of course, the problem comes when there's a disparity in the agreement to the conflict. The Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor couple both agree at one level. They are a match. And I think the point about conflict is where the asymmetry arises, and because where the potential asymmetry arises is where the anxiety comes. Or, you mentioned parents, where parents are in dispute and the children observe them. What for the parents might be an acceptable level of conflict because it's balanced and equal, for children can be experienced very, very differently as a source of deep upset and anxiety and worry.
Yes, exactly. And, going back to Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor for a moment, just because they're such a wonderful example. As you say, that couples that fight, that have a lot of conflict in the relationship, it probably works best when there are ground rules, where there are no-go areas.
Yeah, safe words.
Yes. And then we see, when we take that further and we open up a constellation, we see that the conflict, when there is no frame around the conflict, that is when it stops being loving. And obviously we see that globally.
Yeah.
So that pain happens when conflict, I would say, as the peacemaker here, when it's not held within that, even very wide boundary of love.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've only got a couple of minutes, really. But I wanted to finish and get your reactions on the idea, kind of methodologically, of conflict in constellations, which is to do with the role of the constellator. Because in a sense, as a constellator, one goes into the room as peacekeeper, certainly not as warmonger. One isn't there to stir things up. And as we said at the beginning, our title, From Conflict to Peace, is also the protocol, I suppose, with which the constellator enters the room. And I was very struck by you talking earlier about peace as a kind of holding function. And I think as a constellator, that's what one is trying to do, to hold the frame. We talked about framing in conflictual relationships, hold the frame so that conflict can occur within it, even with the issue holder or between the representatives, even among the holding circle for that matter. But the constellator has to take a side, actually, and the side is that of peace and holding that frame. I just wanted to add that, and
yes,
before we finish, see if you wanted to react to that.
Yes, so I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because when conflict appears in a constellation, it depends on who it's between, but our interest is, we say we're allied to the system, but in relation to through the issue holder. That's our portal of entry into the system, is through the issue holder. So there is a sense that we are balanced, we're open, but we put a little more weight onto the issue holder or seeker's side, in the sense that we hold their feet a little closer to the fire if the conflict is between them and someone else in their system, in the sense to find do they just want to keep the division? Is this just a separation, which could be, and a distance that will be made, and a sort of a closing and ending? Or is it a recognition of the two sides of the dynamic?
Yeah.
And so in a sense, as I said, we put a little more heat on the issue holder or seeker just because they're in the room, they're live, they're here. They're the one who has the issue. They're the one who has the sort of resolving energy because they've maybe come to a workshop or an individual session. So we've got a potential movement within them. And we don't have the other person literally in the room, but we have a representation of them. So I think it's an interesting kind of process where we're open to both possibilities, that maybe this is just, finishing an incomplete ending, but an ending which might give freedom.
Yeah, very good.
So thank you everybody for watching and listening. Please like, share and subscribe. That helps to keep us enthusiastic about doing these recordings. And if you have a special request, please put it in the comments. We're very interested in that. And if you want to find Robert, you can find him at robertrowlandsmith.com. And if you wanted to contact me, I'm at Nicola Dunn, constellations.com. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.